I would just like to say that I'm here because I am very deeply concerned about the ongoing erosion of civil liberties and freedom of speech in this country. We now have the most repressive laws ever in place to silence dissent. And it seems to me that the law, which we are taught to believe exists for our own protection and safety, is failing. It's being used not to protect citizens, but rather to shelter those few with vested interests in making vast profits from fossil fuels at the expense of all and everyone else. We've seen the landscape of peaceful protest transformed. Since 2019, the number of people in prison for it has risen incrementally. The new legislation, which we know was drafted for the former Tory government by right-wing think tanks, funded by fossil fuel companies and with vested interests, therefore, has created new offences that have never existed before in history. For example, there is someone now in prison for 6 months for walking down a road for 30 minutes. It's very important, I think, to remember that non-violent direct action only happens, this form of protest only happens when all else has failed. I've been working this week with the 6 doctors who broke some windows at JP Morgan in 2022, and following their trial, which was in June of this year, they 3 times went to JP Morgan requesting a meeting with the senior management team. They presented a letter for which they got no reply. They presented a petition from which they had no response. So it's very important to remember that when people say, but it's not democratic to violate somebody else's property, it's always because everything else has failed. In relation to Gaza, I am clear that I am witnessing something I have never seen before in my lifetime, and the carnage and the brutality is unprecedented. And for me, as was eloquently spoken this morning this week by the President of Ireland, that to stay silent in the face of this massacre is criminal in itself. And I know that history will look back at this period and say, how was it possible to stay silent in the face of this amount of bloodshed and this mass slaughter of innocent civilians? As we look back at periods of history ourselves now and think, how was it that people did not act, and how was it possible to remain silent? And I feel that very, very strongly. Which takes me to Lord Walney, because as Tim said, and I won't repeat what he said about Lord Walney's vested interests, but he is also a member of Labour Friends for Israel, which may impact on his relationship to protests about Gaza and calls for a ceasefire. It's also interesting to note that he wants the legislation to go further and to criminalize even things like fundraising for protest. So I think it's very, very urgent that we call for his resignation, or for him to be removed as a so-called independent advisor, because independent he certainly is not. He feels entitled, in a recent interview I heard, to talk about climate change as potentially a terrorist threat, where not a single person has ever been harmed, and by definition, climate protesters are committed to non-violent direct action. When asked about the suffragettes breaking glass and breaking windows in their campaign, he said it was not a relevant comparison because they did not have the vote, which implied that now, because we have universal suffrage, that we are only entitled to use that method, which is obviously on 2 counts absurd. One, of course, is that children don't have the vote, and climate change protest is very centered on the future for our children and our young people. And secondly, that the vote has got us nowhere so far.